and you really do need somebody to help guide you along to start. If you look around the room here, there's various levels of expertise, and I've never met anybody so far that wasn't willing to share what they do know. There's none of this condescending approach in this game that I've seen anyway. And if you speak to the right people and get good guidance, you're on your way. Now, they'll all show you what they're comfortable in using. I'm happy to share what I use, but that doesn't mean to say that it's the only solution. There's plenty of good stuff out there, as long as you know how to use that stuff properly. Otherwise you end up in this Ford versus Holden nonsense. It doesn't really take you anywhere. It's knowing where you want, like Simon said, where you want to go. Are you a hunter? Are you a target shooter? Or have you got military law enforcement applications, which obviously is not this, but obviously all those applications are different. And when you know where you want to go, you find somebody who's really good in that area, and I'm sure they're happy to help you. Yeah. And don't be embarrassed to ask.
Yeah.
I think you're already on the right path. You've come out to a club. There's, like Steve's saying, there's a wealth of knowledge. The community, the PRS community, is the best one that I've been involved with so far. You'll rock up. Someone's like, here, shoot my rifle. Like, I've got enough rounds, shoot my rifle in the match. Like, use my bag, use my spotter, use my everything. They're fantastic. So I think you're well on track to go that way. One of the things you can probably expand as well on what Steve has said is you don't have to. A lot of the time you're spending big dollars to save time. If you've got time, like if you enjoy just pottering around in your loading bench, you don't have to spend huge dollars to make accurate reloading, like accurate reloads.
Yeah.
If you a good quality beam scale, you can get just as accurate as a $2,000 A&D scale, but you're going to do it probably 400% longer. So you don't feel like you have to splash out on that stuff to get the accuracy. You can get it, but it's going to come at the cost of time quite often.
This is my dad's old beam scale that I don't even know how old. It's still got dust and mould and everything on it, and that's what I have been using up until 2 nights ago. And exactly the same as Plushy said, my rounds were super precise. Just it nearly cost me a divorce because I spent so much time in the reloading shed making ammo.
Well, there's a guy sitting in the back here. What do you load with, Travi? You finished top 10 at every PRS match you've shot in. Yeah.
There you go. So that simple stuff can work if you've got the time to run it. Anything to add there, Andy, or we'll move on?
Yeah, well, just jumping back to the side of the wealth of information out there. I'm more of a visual guy. Like, no doubt, books and the information in books is really important, and it's somewhat verified and tested. With the YouTube sort of stuff, I like to look at reviews and people how they do comparisons and things, and that's where I'll go for that sort of information on what presses are used for what processes are used in what situations. But then, be aware that when they say use this bullet with this load with this primer, that's don't go into that side of it. But in terms of, there are some really good videos out there in terms of for basic hunting ammo. These are the steps. Clean, resize, prime, powder, bullet, and it's they'll run you through those basic steps. But in terms of the actual combination, that's something where you'll need to delve into it a bit more information and stuff. But
got a couple of recommendations on places to go on the internet.
Yep.
Accurate Shooter, you touched on that last night. They do a daily bulletin which will give you the shortened version or the executive summary of an article that's been written. It's those are fantastic. There's like wind reading, there's everything to do with shooting. It's fantastic. There's a forum on there which is pretty good as well. The Precision Rifle blog, he does some really, really good equipment reviews. He basically goes to, primers, powder, barrels, scopes, the works. That's pretty good. What else is there out there? Ultimate Reloader's pretty good, although he's got a bit of he pushes product a little bit now.
I find combing through Sniper's Hide forums as well, if you're clued in enough to know to filter the crap from stuff, because there is a lot of top guys often coming in and commenting on those Sniper's Hide forums. Maybe if you're just starting, it might be a bit overwhelming, but if you can filter through and go, this guy's just running his mouth versus this guy actually knows his stuff, I find the Sniper's Hide forums as well. I don't know, when I was starting, I'd just type in a press or dies or a scope and then write sniper's hide that I was interested in and then just go through and just read what everyone was saying about it. And by the end of it, you sort of start to get a feel for like, oh, okay, maybe this or that. And then obviously you're verifying that with other things and talking to guys at the club and stuff. But
I think the only major challenge I have there, because yes, there's quite a lot of gold nuggets out there, but there's an awful lot of manure between them. And the big challenge that I'm finding now is that the American marketers are getting pretty slick, and basically anyone pops up as an influencer, they get targeted by brand managers, and the next thing you know, you're getting a particular avenue forced down your throat, and it's not necessarily rubbish, but it can be biased. So you just got to be careful to take, especially when you're looking at stuff on the internet from America, you've just got to be really careful about what you're taking on board. Verify, check with other knowledgeable people to see if they're getting the same results that are being espoused, and take it from there, because there really is the marketing is getting better than the product these days.
Yeah, not wrong. Who else had their hand up for a first time reloading? Yeah, mate, have you got a beginning question you're itching to ask?
I haven't gotten into any reloading at all yet, but with my limited experience with factory loads, and I know twist rates and barrels and stuff come into it, but so far with what I've shot, I've had some really big differences with different factory loads, and if I was going to start reloading, which I will be, is there any helpful tips, I guess, you might be able to provide where I can, as much as possible, try and cut down on that, like
Filter through what's not going to work to get to what is going to work.
I know what type of rifle you got and barrel and everything will affect that, but you know, I want to try and piss fart around as least as possible.
Yep.
To try and get results, really.
Well,
Does that make sense?
yeah, that makes heaps of sense. Are you itching to go for it, Andy? Go.
Yeah, I'm doing that at the moment. My 223. So running some ADI factory 69 grain stuff, and now I'm delving into replicating that load by reloading. So first of all, I'm reusing the same brass. So keep your brass from your factory ammunition. Go and buy the same projectile if you can. If it's not the same brand, then try and keep it the same weight at least, I guess. And then
There's a bit of this Godfather sort of thing sitting here where everyone's like, is Steve okay with what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Just charge on. Don't worry. I'll take care of Steve. Right? It's all good. It's all good. It's all good.
We're just talking about not pushing brand.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Yeah. And then with your factory loads, throw them over a chronograph so you get your velocity. And then you're essentially going to try and replicate that while you're reloading. So same projectile, same brass. You adjust your powder to replicate that same velocity. And then with your seating depth, you can play around with your seating depth a little bit. You might be able to fine tune it and get it more accurate. But if it's working for you with factory, then just copy that seating depth off the...
So if it's not working off that factory ammo,
Yep.
do I move away from doing that? Do you know what I mean? If
Yeah.
I'm using a factory load,
Yep.
and I'm not getting good results,
Yep.
would I
So-
just try another factory load first?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
That's one way of doing it.
One way of getting pretty close. We had a bit of an in-depth chat last night about twist rate and things like that, and so I'm probably going to send this one to Steve as well to chime in there. Just out of curiosity, what rifle are you shooting?
So I'm using, for deer hunting, I'm using a Remington 700 BDL 270.
Yep.
I don't know
The twist rate?
I do.
someone probably.
What is it? And is that the only rifle?
Here's the
No,
one
no,
in.
no, I've got a couple. I really wanted 223, but I've got a couple of 22s as well. But
Yeah.
that's,
So that 270, is that the main one you're thinking you're going to reload for and try and chase?
yeah. And with my hunting, like I'm not. I think like what you were saying earlier, I'm not a big dollar. Like I'm not going to go buy $3,000 scope.
Good.
Shoot deer. I'm shooting $100 scope.
Yep.
I'm successful with it so far.
Yep.
Just want to fine tune. Like I just don't want to spend that much on hunting venison.
Yeah, totally.
So,
Yeah. Oh well, you know the rifle, you know the caliber. Are you going to chime in with what your thoughts are there on that
just
one?
about all the American 30 cals and 270s all come in at one twist, right?
Yeah.
You sometimes get variation when you bringing supplies in from, say, Europe. Like a standard 30 cal twist from Europe is 11. A standard 30 cal twist from America is 10. Now, you said that you were using a Remington Booty L on a 270.
I am, yes.
Yeah, so I guarantee you've got a 1 in 10 inch twist, right?
Yeah.
And the 270 is one of the very, very few calibers that don't come in very many options. It's 1 in 10 or 1 in 10. It's the Henry Ford option of black. There are many other calibers like the 223. You can get 1 in 14, 1 in 12, 1 in 9, 1 in 8, 1 in 7, right? And you can get them all in factory. Now, unless you know what 223 twist rate barrel you've got, if you're not getting accuracy with, say, ADI 69 grainers, it's probably a mismatch between your bullet and your barrel twist, right? It doesn't mean that the ammunition's bad. It doesn't mean that the rifle's bad. It means it's a mismatch and you're putting petrol in your diesel, right? If it's not stabilising and not working for you, it's a mismatch to your barrel twist. And that 223 could be any one of those, right? And until you know, what I'm suggesting is if you're getting silly groups with your 69 grain Sierras out of an ADI load in your 223, you've probably got a 12 or a 14 inch twist, and it's just not going to work no matter what you do. And it doesn't matter if you've got there's nothing you can do with reloading with that brass or with that projectile or a different powder that's going to correct that, because it's a mismatch. If you go to just about everybody got here by driving. I don't know whether you drive petrols or diesel, but you don't put petrol in your diesel or diesel in your petrol. And if your vehicle's designed for 98, 95 and 91 and you put a different grade of fuel in it, you're not going to get the same level of performance. That's exactly what's happening in your situation. And because the 69 grainers aren't stabilising, you're probably going to have to go with, I'm going to say, a lighter bullet. But the lighter, it's not weight that determines it, it's the length of the bullet.
I think correct me if I'm wrong, you don't have a 223 yet, you're looking at getting a 223. Oh, it was Andy that was,
Yeah, I've got a 270.
it's 270, yeah.
Yep.
Which I've tried. So to give you an idea, I'm hunting with 150 grain Remington core lock, which it works, but hitting a paper target is not very nice. Like
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
It's a
that,
hunting rifle at the end of the day.
yeah,
I
so
put 130 grain Winchester ballistic tips through it, which I know is quite different, and that was beautiful.
so there you go. So shooting the
and that
270.
comes back to the length of the bullet, because you can have a 200 grain bullet. Pick a 30 cal, for instance. You can have a 200 grain bullet that's this long, and you can have a 200 grain bullet that's this long. The weight 200 grains means nothing. It's the length of the bullet that has to be matched to that barrel twist. So I can almost guarantee you that a 200 grain round nose soft point is going to work in just about any twist in a 30 cal. But a very long target Spitzer long boat tail job is going to require a fast twist rate to stabilise, and they're both 200 grain, right? So you've got to step back and go, weight's much less important to the weight to length to twist ratio, of which weight is only one particular component. And if you only focus on the weight, you're going to get yourself into trouble.
So when you go to a lighter projectile, do you get a greater velocity?
Well, yes.
Yeah. Okay. So that's.
So I guess if you wanted to stay in that heavier projectile weight, you could try a different brand, which might be, like you're saying, a longer projectile or have more bearing surface.
The problem with going down that path is many of the 150s, 160s and 170 grain projectiles in 270, and I've worked at the professional level using 270s for more than 30 years, they're marginally stable. And it doesn't have to be too much longer for it never to be able to shoot, because it's marginally stable in a 1 in 10 inch twist. And it depends on at what elevation and what temperature and what air pressure as to whether or not it'll be on the right side or the wrong side of that very fine tipping point. It's very unusual for a 130 grain or lighter pill not to stabilise in a 1 in 10. Now, this infatuation with heavier bullets to me just drives me nuts, because most people measure the weight of their bullet before it's been shot. It's pointless. It's the weight of the bullet when it's done its job that matters. So if it was a 110 grain bullet and kept all its weight, it's heavier than a 130 grain bullet that lost half or more of its weight, right? And jacketed lead bullets come in two forms. Well, many forms, but for this sake of this argument, they're either jacketed lead and they're not core bonded, so they're highly frangible and dissipate all their particles very, very quickly. Or if you insist on using jacketed lead bullets, a core bonded product like the Woodley or some of the other in that ilk will lose about 25% of their weight. Well, 75% of that means that 75% of that material is still available to do the job, and 75% of 130 is a damn sight better than 25% of 150.
Yeah. So Steve's monolithic stuff, I haven't used it, but generally they run a little bit on the lighter side, and you run a bit more velocity, and they've still got quite a good BC attached to them, so good performance. Just quickly, what would you recommend? I know Andy's got a recipe for his 270 that he used to shoot, he used to shoot 270. But what would be your, on the outer edge side of things, which projectiles would you be recommending he tries for a 270?
It depends what you're using it on. If I was shooting Samber, I'd be going for the 132s, simply because you need it to be legally compliant. But in New South Wales, we don't have those kind of limitations, and we use much lighter bullets for devastating results. But that's because we lose less than 2% of our weight on impact. Right?
What do you use over there?
Sorry, no, we don't use lead. We use copper.
What weight are you using in a
we
270?
have 110s, 120s, and 132s, and unless you're shooting Samber, 110 will flatten anything you want to hunt inside of 400 metres.
Yeah. What about you, Andy? What did you run in your 270 when you were hunting with it?
Yeah, so like you said, I've found mine running the 130 grain projectiles the best. I can't remember the powder charge. That was years ago.
Gives him
Probably don't want to share that.
just thinking a rough ballpark.
You really don't want to grab somebody else's load and just run with it anyway.
No,
Yeah.
It's not what you want to do.
no. But I'm just more thinking about, he wanted to scale down on what projectile weights and things to use.
I think running back to your original question, if it was me, I would be looking on some reputable forums, looking at your particular rifle and what other people have had success using for reloading. It's no guarantee, but it's a good indicator. If lots of people have been using X bullet and it's been working really well, I'd be looking at that. And then I'd be looking at, okay, that's the bullet that's going to do my intended purpose, shooting deer or whatever it is. So it's going to keep together, it's going to expel the energy in the animal, and then come back and research a load development method. You can't always, but you can almost make any projectile work in any. No, so you can't. If it's going to stabilise, you can generally make it work to an acceptable level.
By playing with things like seating depth and powder charge and
stuff like that. So yeah, that's what I'd harp back to. Find out what works for other people. You don't have to be a unicorn. Like if it works for them, like it can work for you. It can shortcut your process as well. That'd be my advice. Talk to people, find out what works, and then do your load development and make it work for you.
So to summarise basically what all three of us have said in a roundabout sort of way, the first thing you do when you reload is you've got to match your bullet to your barrel twist, and if that bullet is stable, if your bullet selection is stable in that barrel, you can probably make it work. Yeah, okay. Right?
What were the links we had that we talked about last night? Some online calculators for working out stability factors.
There is, as Simon mentioned before, there's a website called Accurate Shooter, and there's on Accurate Shooter there's a little program you can look up called the Miller Stability Formula. Now, what's been published there is one of three versions of it, and it's the one that works fairly well on my style of bullet and on a jacketed lead bullet that comes to a fairly fine point. But it gives misleading results on ballistic tip bullets, and it makes them look substandard to what they really are. So you do have to be careful. If you're going to use the Miller stability formula, and you insist on using an inferior plastic ballistic tip, then if whatever figure you get has been understated by 5%. Right, so if it says that it's 1.48, it's probably around about 1.56, 1.57, which means it's perfectly fine. But without getting into which formula and how to apply it, it'll drive you nuts, and you don't need to go there. I'm just simply saying.
It's an online calculator, isn't it?
Yep.
Where it has your bullet weight, your bullet length,
and download it.
Yeah, and then it spits out a number, and then there's a variance on whether that's very stable, marginally stable, or unstable. And so whatever number comes out, obviously, then you're able to go, oh well, there's no point in me trying to run that projectile, or bang, I'm in the money. So that's essentially what it is. Yep.
So we're talking about bullet length. Are we talking overall length, or are we talking ogive length?
Okay, so that I'm just going to repeat
Overall
that for
length.
people listening.
Overall length. Ogive length is only used for the purposes of setting your jump to the lands. It's absolutely irrelevant to bullet stability. Overall length of the bullet determines the bullet stability, not the ogive engagement.
There you go. So, yeah, the question was whether, just for our listeners and people that are watching in on Facebook, the question was whether for stability we're looking at overall length or we're looking at ogive, like bearing surface length and things like that. And Steve was saying that the overall length is the key number you
Determining
need.
factor.
Yep. Okay, cool. That's fine, mate. And obviously with everyone, feel free. We're going to have time afterwards when we finish. If I don't get to you with a question or you want to ask more in-depth on that, we're going to hang out here for a while afterwards, and you can come and pick these guys' brains. We probably found last night that was the most engaging part of the night because you get to sort of have some one-on-one chats. But who else was it that had their hand up for those just starting reloading questions? Yeah, go for it, mate. Shoot.
Well, I don't really have too much questions.
I'll do this for you so then catch it online.
The boys here. Do you want me to hold it?
Yeah,
Is that
that'd
easy
be
for you?
great.
All right, no worries.
Don't get that off every day.
Yeah, you don't have to stand or kneel.
I don't really have too many questions because, like I said, these boys here just kind of touched on base. But, I'm essentially just trying to work out a good load for a 300 Win Mag. Landed on 200 grain Accubon. Was tossing up between the 180s and the 200s. But now, listening to you boys with your overall length, I've put a lot of, I was emphasising a lot on the difference between the 20 grains of the 180 to the 200, which now I'm kind of leaning towards it's not really going to have too much effect on me. And essentially, just hunting Samba. So, any thoughts on that would be pretty helpful.
Hunting Samba, long-range hunting Samba or stalk in and hunt most of your stuff inside 200 metres?
It's a bit hard to say, really. But, we're going to be the chance of both shots is pretty well there.
Yep. And in what rifle are you shooting?
The 300.
What brand rifle is it? It's a okay. Do you know
it's a
do you
lightweight
know the
hunting
twist
rifle.
rate? Do you know the twist rate of your barrel?
No, it's a 1 in 11.
There you go.
But it's also a lightweight stalking rifle. It's not a belly flopper's gun. It's not a heavyweight sniper's rifle.
In no way, shape, and form.
No, it's a 1 in 11 inch twist. So people get really excited about weight, but really the issue is momentum. In other words, it's the combination of mass times velocity. But it's not the mass that started, it's the mass that is holding together and doing the job. So mass times velocity will give you simple momentum. A 150 grain pill that weighs 150 grain when it's doing its job has a lot more momentum than a 200 grain projectile that lost 75% of its weight on impact. I mean, you don't have to be a brilliant mathematician to go, oh shit, that's fairly obvious. But weight is something that has been heavily focused on, because up until the last 20 years, for 100 and God knows how, way more than 120 years, bullets were all made the same way. They were jacketed lead, right? So it was fairly simple to say that this jacketed lead weighed 200 grain, this one weighed 100 grain. Therefore, whether they both lost 50% or 75 or 25, this one was always going to be proportionately heavier than that one. But when you get into the monolithic side of the equation, the rules change completely. So if you've got two bullets that are absolutely identical in form function, side by side, a jacketed lead bullet is going to weigh 20% more than a copper bullet, right? Simply because lead's heavier than copper. But it's the length to twist to weight ratio. And you've got a Sarco which has an 11-inch twist, because all the Sarcos have an 11-inch twist in the 30 cals. And when you let go of the subject of weight and then start looking at the subject of bullet structure, you're then able to make different choices. We've got a 27-inch samber head on the wall that hit a running away samber in the left ball joint of the hip, and the bullet exited here, and it just all four legs just went out like that. Right? That was 150 grainer. Right? The weight of the bullet in the magazine is irrelevant. It's the weight of the bullet when it hits that matters. And whether it's you talk about sectional density, anything else along those lines, when you start going down the path of thinking weight only, you're only looking at 1/3 of the formula, and you've forgotten 2/3 of it, so it can only be 1/3 right.
I guess one other thing from like a hunting point of view, which I guess ties in with the weight, is also with weight. A lighter weight bullet, you'll get a higher velocity and less drop. I would assume. I would hope so.
If it's not, you're doing something wrong. Defying science.
That's it. And with most of your ballistic calculators, they can also dictate how much energy that can put into your game. Yeah. So by dropping down to your 180 grain, you might find that you're getting a bit more velocity, a flatter trajectory. That's the one. Shoot straight. And then and in turn, depending on your distance, you might actually end up with more energy. Yeah. So you have a more efficient round.
It's going to be the combination of both, because you still want the knockdown power when you get there, but like Andy's saying, for hunting, which is normally unknown distance, if you're long range hunting and you've got a rangefinder and you've got time to make a range, get an accurate reading, make a calculation, the speed can be to a lesser degree, irrelevant, because you're able to calculate that drop. If it's unknown range hunting where opportunity presents itself and you don't know if it's 100 meters, 200 meters, or anywhere in between, that flatter trajectory is something that you're going to want to consider having. So I'm not saying none of us are saying go lighter, but it's worth looking at the option of going, I just need the heaviest, bullet for that knockdown power. May not be the case.
Which also brings you back. So for many, many years, they've talked about things like sectional density and energy. Well, sectional density is always measured when the bullet's in the magazine, not when it's actually doing the job. If it's blown to lots and lots of little tiny bits, it doesn't have any sectional density at all. It doesn't matter what weight it was when it started. If it doesn't, if they're all little tiny fragments now, then it doesn't have any sectional density at all. A bullet that, let's say you pick a 150 grain copper bullet that doubled its size, or double dimension expansion, it's half the sectional density of what it was when it was in the magazine, but half of 0.285 or whatever it is a damn sight better than nothing at all.
Yeah.
And when it comes to energy, the formula for energy is mass times velocity squared, right? These are really ethereal numbers that really don't mean very much. To be honest, they mean jack shit. The issue is, did the bullet reach through and smash the vitals? If it did that, it worked. If it didn't do that, all the numbers mean nothing, right? If the bullet weighed 200 grains but completely fragmented and didn't reach the vitals, you're going to knock it to the ground and you think, you're beauty, and walk up, and while you're busy walking up, it's jumped to its feet and run away. Right? If you smash the vitals, whether the bullet stayed inside or went through, it's irrelevant. If you didn't smash the vitals, Whether the bullet stayed inside or went through was still irrelevant. Did you smash the vitals is the only issue. Yeah?
Yeah, I was just going to say sometimes the simple one is best for me as well, assuming that you've worked up a load for both. I'm not familiar with the projectiles, but if one of them shoots better than the other,
Go the accurate load.
just run it. And if you feel comfortable with one over the other and they both shoot the same, run it. Like there's no point having all of this information in the background kicking over the back of your head and then you're too busy thinking about that and the sandbar's running away. Like you've got to hit the thing first. So be confident in what you're running. Like you don't want to be, don't fret over it so much that you don't take the shot and you sort of, psych yourself out almost.
And something like that I've noticed since starting to shoot PRS with these guys is get out and shoot more. Like there's no replacement for shot placement. If you use that rifle once or twice a year, you could have the best load and the best bullet. And if you're not sticking it where it needs to go, like Steve's saying, you don't smash vitals, doesn't matter.
I'll be honest, I shoot probably 10, 20,000 rounds a year. And I'll get a nice looking fallow in my crosshairs and the little shakes come in and you're like, oh, I don't want to miss. And you're like, every day of the week I'd make that shot and it starts playing on your mind.
Yeah. Get out in practice. Cool.
And it just comes back to, look, even the highly frangible bullets, and there are some really highly frangible 30 cals, right? If you slip between the ribs on a perfect broadside, an animal's going to go down like a sack of potatoes, right? Hit the rib and it might not, right? Do you have the discipline to let it go if it's running away on a Texas heart shot? Yeah. And that's what I put to most hunters is, do you have that discipline? And I've got to tell you, when you see the stag of a lifetime up and running and all you've got's a Texas heart shot, I've yet to see the fellow who didn't lift the rifle. Yeah? And if you know that frangible bullet isn't going to reach the vitals, you made your mistake long before you walked out into the bush.
I think the other thing to be aware of as well is be aware of your equipment and your personal limitations as well. If you're sitting there on the hill looking at the sambar of a lifetime on the far ridge and it's 600 meters away, and you're like, I don't know if I can hit that. You probably shouldn't be taking the shot. You have to be, as you're pulling the trigger, you're like, I'm going to hit this every day of the week. Yeah. You don't want something that's got a gut shot or something like that, a leg missing or running off through the forest. That's not what we're about.
Sweet, that's a good question, man. I learned some stuff there, so thank you for that. Anyone else itching with a question? We can start moving through if we got some more advanced stuff, or anyone having problems with maybe setting up reloading gear, struggling with setting up a die or things like that. Is there anyone who's got any of that sort of stuff? Travi's got one. Yeah. Hang on. Sorry, Travi. I'm going to make you do this too.
So I only used to neck size with my 243 comp rifle, and I've switched over to 4-length sizing in my 6XC because apparently it's a bit more accurate and more reliable. What I've actually noticed in measuring the shoulder bump is I'm actually getting quite a bit of variance in my shoulder bump. So I've played around with different amounts of case lube inside the neck, outside the neck, on the body, all that sort of stuff. But I'm just trying to find what's the best way to get more consistent shoulder bump.
How much is your variance?
My variance is quite substantial. We're talking sort of 40 thou, I think. So yeah, quite a lot. So, and you can definitely feel it. So I've tried a few different cases with different amounts of lube inside the neck, etc. And I've started to reduce it down, but it's still not consistent enough for my liking.
So what you said 40 thou, like 40?
He said 40, but I think it's probably 4 thou. Yeah.
4 thou, right, cool.
Which is still too much variance.
You shouldn't shoot next to me ever.
Yeah. That's a really good question. Plushy, might get you to answer that one.
I'd be looking at, I know you just bought an annealer. I'd be looking at, before you had an annealer, were you batching your brass, so same number of firings, or did you have multiple, like 3 firings, 4 firings, 6 firings all in the same batch? Yeah, that's why. Because you weren't annealing. So you're not bringing it back to a consistent, like a standard. I think when you start or if you haven't started using your annealer already, your problem will probably go away.
I've had the same thing. I haven't gotten an annealer, and I've noticed that I've had to keep changing my resizing die for that same reason, because the amount of shoulder bump I was getting the first time is now different after 5-6 firings on that brass.
For me, if you don't have an annealer and you don't plan on annealing, I would be very careful about batching your brass to number of firings. So you're doing the same amount of work hardening every firing, and you're going to get the same result. It might not be the exact same result every firing every time you reload, but it's going to be close and it's going to be the same, which is more important.
Is there in like annealing aside, is there anything else in that sizing die setup that he should be looking at that could be giving inconsistencies?
There could be a bunch of things, yes.
I've got a question to ask. Is it all the same brand of brass from the same batch? It is,
Yeah.
That minimises your challenge. I've seen fellas come up with some ridiculous results simply because they mix different brands of brass, or depending on the source of the brass, different batches of brass. Some brands, you've got to have the same batch for it to be consistent, whereas some of the European stuff, for instance, if it's as long as it's from the same manufacturer, you can find that the consistency from batch to batch to batch is close enough not to have to worry about. But I check it anyway.
Yeah. What would you? Because obviously, we always want the number to be exactly the same, but there's always going to be variance. What are you guys happy with shoulder bump variance numbers wise? Or are you
the same number every time?
okay?
I've got a very developed process, I suppose, and I don't deviate from the process, and I get the same result every time. That's the key for me.
Yep.
It always bumps the same amount every time. It just doesn't change. Like some of that stuff on my last lot of brass is 20 firings in.
Yeah.
It's still performing like fantastically.
Are you measuring down to like half thou here? Yep.
Yep.
So you're also using a good measuring equipment as well,
like
because there's going to be
yeah,
equipment that
Mitoto,
can't actually measure that well.
Like a Mitoto said it. Mitoto?
Minotaur,
Whatever it is, I can't
yeah.
pronounce it. Like I said, verniers, I've got micrometers and stuff like that to measure. Using Hornady comparator, yeah. I think that would be it for me.
The annealing.
Yeah.
Yep.
The other one, you're still using your Lee press, aren't you?
RCBS.
You got
RCBS
a
rock chucker.
Rock chucker. I'll call you on. Oh, so you got the Forster lock ring as well. That's perfect. I was going to ask if you're using your Lee, if you're using the quick change stuff, get rid of it. But I'm pretty confident that it's going to be annealing based.
Cool.
Yeah, something I saw recently. Ultimate Reloader did a video. I think it was him, where just by the amount of force he put on his press changed his results in terms of shoulder bump and resizing.
So you mean as far as like if he did it really quickly and hard, or versus just
well, it was
consistency,
more
or?
like once you set up your die, if you've got a little bit of a cam over, if you just let it cam over and then bring it back, you'd get a different result to if he let it cam over and gave it a bit more
on the end.
So just be consistent in that, I guess, as well.
Some presses won't allow you to do that. Will they? They'll have a mechanical stop that stops you.
There are pressure gauges you can put on certain types of die systems, but more often than not, that's any variance there is to do with how you prepped your brass. If you're using, most people that go to the trouble of using that kind of gear aren't using poor quality bullets, so it's very unusual for the bullet to have much influence on that subject. It all comes down to your brass prep as to what sort, and the if you're using bushings in your dies, which most of the quality set up, so if you're using the right bushing, then it should be very consistent if you're using high quality brass.
Cool.
Yeah.
That question was, how often do you anneal? That's a great question.
Personally, every time. It's just part of my process now. If I'm going to shoot on Saturday and I don't have clean brass, I know I've got to start on Tuesday. If I start on Wednesday, I'm going to have some late nights, so it's routine for me now. I don't batch my brass. I've got a dirty bin for each caliber or each rifle, whatever, and a clean bin. There's no batching involved, and I'm not seeing any variation because of the annealing, I think.
So if you don't have an annealer, how often do you just check the length, how much it grows?
Well, we're talking about trimming now. Depends on the caliber as to how often I'm checking overall length. Like some calibers grow more than others,
and some are much harsher than others. And the quality, and there are too many variables to open that Pandora's box, because the ductility and the quality of the brass is something you can't assess, but that changes, and that will continue to change if you're not annealing.
You deprime and full length before you trim? Or you
So my process, we'll just start at the start. I've got a fired case. I've got a decapping pin. So knock the primer out only, straight into the wet pin stainless steel tumbler until that's clean. Comes out, goes into a dehydrator overnight, 10 hours of dehydration to get rid of the moisture. Next night, I use Imperial sizing wax. It's a good product. It goes a long way and it's easy to get off. I full length size every time. I use bushing dies. I actually, and this don't feel like this is a step you need to do, but I actually have a bushing that's smaller than what I'm looking for. So I oversize the brass down, and then I use an expander mandrel on the inside of the case to take the case back out to the diameter that I'm looking for. That's starting to get really into the nitty gritty. But I full length size every time.
That's a mandrel die just for opening the neck back up. So
Yeah, so instead of with a bushing die, your standard expandable fine, because they do the exact same process. Your standard Hornady undersizes the neck, and then you drag the expandable and pulls everything out. With a bushing die, if you've got any imperfections in the neck, you're pushing them in, so you can get imperfections touching the bullet. By putting the expander mandrel in there, it's pushing it back out again if there is any, and I find I get a better result with that. But yeah, so full length size, back in the full length size, measure, trim if I have to. I don't do that every time, I'll be honest. Probably every 3 or 4 I'll check. But I know my brass, I know how much it grows, so I'm not everybody's different. But yeah, so I measure length after full length sizing, and then trim to the same. Chamfer deburr back into the tumbler without any pins. Just tumble the sizing wax off back into the dehydrator again overnight, and then I can start priming and charging and stuff like that.
do you run small primer pockets or large pockets?
Depends on the caliber. Largely small. It's weird. Yeah, mostly small rifle primers.
And to be honest,
anneal. Sorry, I decap, clean, then anneal. Left out that step before sizing. Yeah.
And whether you go small primer or large primer really should be dependent on the firing pin in your bolt. Right. I see little point in going down the path of using a small primer pocket, a small primer if you've got a large primer firing pin. Although under our current supply chain challenges, sometimes you just have to deal with what you can get, and you can get puerile about it, and it does introduce other challenges. But it's pointless saying to somebody, if you've got a large rifle pin, don't use small rifle primer or small rifle brass if you can't get anything else. I mean, it doesn't make sense, but things were made to match in a particular way, and if you can match them, do it.
Cool. Yeah. Any other? Who's got one? Anyone itching to ask something?
Can you tell me the difference between standard primers and Magnum primers?
Yeah.
Standard primer versus Magnum primer. What's the difference?
Yes, they are different, and it's mostly made up with a small dusting of aluminium powder, sometimes a little bit of magnesium. It burns hotter, and the technical term is brisance, or brisance, I should say. And brisance is the intensity of the flame and the duration of the flame. A Magnum primer is not always an advantage, but there are definitely circumstances in which it is. A great starting place would be to look at the reloading manuals and see which powder they recommend for a particular resistance projectile, and whether a standard or a Magnum primer matches that powder best. And a great place to start is the manufacturer's recommendations. There's no blanket answer to that, but there's some pretty solid guidelines which work really well. But I'm really reluctant to lay down absolute rules, because I've seen too many exceptions that go, well, that shouldn't have worked, but it did, or that should have worked and it didn't.
Just a quick one on that. I've heard that with the Magnum primers, the actual cup body is thicker to withstand the higher pressure. Any higher pressure, is that?
That's not actually the case, but
Okay.
But you're on the right track in a sense. Cci and Federal Primers are made in the factory. They're owned by the same company. And there is a difference between Cci and Federal Primers. the US military did a wonderful series of tests on the intensity and consistency of primers, and the most consistent were the Federals, because they had a relatively thin cup, or a relatively soft cup, I should say. The CCI primers tend to be tougher. The consistency was not as high, but in terms of what the actual outcome is on target, there's nothing in it. The only reason I personally prefer the Federal primers is because they're softer. They tend to show pressure before other signs pop up. So if I'm seeing pressure signs in the primer pocket only, but nothing else, I'm going, righto, I'm pushing the envelope here, but at least it's cool. With the CCIs, you can start to have other things turn up at the same time, and you may have already done too much damage when you find that out. So that's just a personal perspective, but is there anything wrong with the CCI primers? No way.
You run them, don't you, Plush? You run CCI?
I've run them for probably 15 years.
Yeah. And there's nothing wrong. And the Wolf primers and the RWS primers and some of the Cellubello product is really good too. I'm not here to promote or discredit any of them. I'm just saying they've got different characteristics, and whatever happens to suit your perspective on what works best. Because Simon has got a formula because his particular package works really well in his kit, and he's getting really, really good results.
Yeah, sure.
But I'm doing product testing for a vast array of stuff, and I want to know where the bump stop is long before damage has been done. And I use a series of indicators to tell me that there's certain issues about to arise. But if you've got, like someone does a package that's working and proven, if it ain't broke, don't fix it.
Yeah, run with it.
Yeah.
That might lead on to, for people starting out, what would those first signs be in a primer? What would stand out to you if you're seeing overpressure?
There are probably three things to look out for, but on their own, they're not diabolically condemning. Like if you're starting to get a little bit of cratering, I'd want to know why. And that can happen because there's not insufficient pressure and the case is sliding in the chamber. You can get cratering from that. That doesn't mean say there's anything wrong, but if you're getting that and carbon around the neck, your chamber pressure is not high enough. All right. I've actually seen loads recommended that was so low the primer was backing out of the case, and it looked like tremendous pressure when it was actually way too low pressure. So if a primer's backing out of the case, your pressure is silly low. It's not sealing. The primer's not sealing in the pocket, and the case neck isn't sealing in the chamber. So people see that and go, oh, the pressures are too high and I'm only using minimum. Well, it's probably the pressure's too low, not too high.
Would that be something you'd see more in subsonic loads, that sort of era, or that sort of
no,
field?
it often occurs in the big calibers, particularly the African type stuff. Right. And it largely happens because those loads were developed for use in 35, 40 degree, and we live in Victoria or wherever it is, and we're testing it at 10 and 5 degrees and wondering why the pressures aren't there. On the other side of the equation, excessive pressure, particularly when it's looking at the Federals, if the primer is flattening or if it's completely bridged the brass, you've cooked it and you've probably done other damage. And it's very difficult to say what safe is without showing it to you. So discussing it's a little bit hard, but even though some of the reloading manuals are very basic on it, and some of the reloading guidelines from, say, Nick Harvey's books are fairly basic, you can get a good series of pictures where you can go, oh, okay, I can see why that one's too low and that one's too high and why these look about right. And it is, to some extent, a bit of a judgment call.
You've got things like ejector swipe, you got sticky bolt lift, like all the other things that come accompanying it.
But the question was regarding the primer.
Yeah,
So, But yes, obviously, if you're getting ejector swipe on the case or sticky lift, you've passed the bump stop well and truly.
It's interesting you talk about ejector swipe. People look at my brass commonly and say, "Ooh, that's hot," because it's got an ejector swipe on it. It's just, I'm like, well, it's not, because I know it's not. But my ticker bolt that I'm running in competition has clearly got quite a strong spring in it.
Yep.
And it's there, but it'd be like you fire a shot and you go click, and out she comes. It's not that alone. It's not an indicator. It's one of the indicators.
And that's why I said at the beginning, these items in individual don't actually tell you everything. You've got to partner them up with other indicators before you go, we've got a problem, or, okay, I have the same problem with my Norma, 300 Norma. Yeah. I've got a really strong ejector pin, and I'll get a case swipe on any load. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. We might throw some questions from online. Is that what Rusty's gesturing at me? So we'll, gesturing.
Is that yours? No.
Steve, possibly a quick one for you. Hopefully quick. We'll see how we go. Any advice for anyone who hasn't had a CD drive for 5 years but wants Quick Load or something similar? For those who don't know, Quick Load is a software package, but it only comes on CD, and it's not the easiest to put on anything else.
Look, Quick Load is a wonderful tool, but it's like that high-grade Formula One Ferrari. You really do need to know how to drive it, or you can get yourself horribly unstuck very, very quickly. And to me, the use of Quick Load is like any other form of reloading. Go to somebody who actually knows what they're doing with it to show you some of the foibles, so you don't catch yourself out. And especially when you're starting, as you say, it's only available on disk, which is a nuisance because they're constantly upgrading or adding new product or making adjustments. It is a great program for calculating your loads, but you have to you can't use it to avoid the basics. So I would still cross-reference against a quality reloading manual, and a quality reloading manual will tell you not just the weight of the bullet, but which bullet, because they've all got different shank lengths and they'll have different resistance, and the weight alone doesn't tell you. So you need to know. So a quality reloading manual will tell you all the details that it was calculated on. And Quick Load might tell you that your particular bullet and your particular brass actually has a different combination, and it's quite often the case. But you need to know how to drive it. And look, that might be a conversation for another day as to how to use or train on that one.
For sure, but is there a different piece of software that's available, or is
other than Quick Load? Yeah, Quick Load Professional.
Okay, no worries. And one other one here. Question regarding case prep. Is it worth checking flash hole sizing for uniform or for deviations? Plushy, perhaps throw that on to you.
Depends what brass you're using. I run Lapua. I don't bother. If I was trying to make some Winchester brass work or something like that, then yeah, maybe I would. I mean, Lapua's drilled. A lot of the other stuff, the cheaper stuff, is punched. Mm-hmm. You're going to get burrs, stuff like that. So it depends on the quality of brass is the answer to that question.
Cool.
But to add to that, though, the flash holes particularly, I've got nothing to add on to what Simon's just said, but something that a lot of reloaders do overlook is that they don't clean their primer pockets out properly, and that's really important. It's just as important as your flash hole, in my view.
We talked about this last night, and Steve was saying there was a case where he had someone come into a gun shop and they were ragging on a particular brand of primers, saying that they flat out don't work. And Steve was like, well, I know they do. And do you have any of those loads that weren't working? And he gave him a round and popped the primer out. And sure enough, there was so much gunk that the primer hadn't seated all the way. So then the primer's got momentum when the firing pin hits it and not getting proper ignition. And this guy was basically saying, I've been reloading for 30 years and you can't tell me what to do. But get that crud out of that primer pocket. It takes 2 seconds.
There was that much dirt in the primer pocket, he couldn't suit it properly.
Yeah.
And the fact that he was getting ignition problems, he was lucky because he could have had flame fire problems, which would have been extremely dangerous. And there is just sometimes you have to stop, shut up and listen.
Ben, you've came to last night and then again to tonight. So you've been here for 2 nights. I know you're a great shooter and have been reloading for a while too. Is there anything that any questions that you're wanting answered or problems you're chasing or anything?
Do you want me to?
Yeah, go for it. That'd be awesome.
Okay, so Thanks for everything you guys have been talking about. It's been really good listening, and I have learnt a lot, particularly from you, Steve, over the last couple of nights. Sorry, Andy.
Yeah. you better not be asking me this question.
I'm wondering if you could tell me the environmental considerations that I would need to look at if I was to use a balance scale for measuring powder versus a strain gauge digital scale versus, say, an A&D, I think, magnetic induction system. What are some of the things that in my reloading room I need to know to get the most consistent results out of those setups?
I'm going to stand back from this because I do all the wrong things.
Can we get Bronte on the phone?
Who do you want to answer that one, Plush, or did you both want to?
I can tell you what not to do.
We'll defer to Steve, and if you miss anything, I'll try and make up the pieces.
Go for it.
That talk about put me on the hot seat.
So basically, to summarise, he's saying the environment in which he's reloading.
So you're talking everything about drafts in the room,
lighting,
air conditioners, fluoro lights, like everything, the bench, the whole, yeah.
And it varies between 5 degrees and 30 degrees. I have a balance scale, that's all I use. Well, and a strain gauge scale.
Yep.
And I'm wanting to know what I need to do to make to give those things the most opportunity to be most consistent.
You can get really itchy and scratchy and fussy about measuring this and measuring that and measuring something else. The only thing that stops me from reloading, because my room is probably like something you've never seen before, so I'm not trying to say you need what I've got because it's a bit ridiculous. But so I do make sure that I'm in a draft-free room. But the only thing that stops me from reloading is extremely high humidity. Because extremely high humidity will affect your primers, and it can affect your powder to a lesser extent. But we've done some interesting tests on that to not be able to provide definitive instruction as to what you should do there, other than to say, if it's a really cold, wet, rainy day, don't go reloading.
That's a perfect day to reload.
Yeah, that's the ultimate temptation. Or if it's an extremely high humidity day in Townsville, I would not be reloading because it does affect.
So what do you do in summer?
Sorry?
So what do you do in summer?
Yeah.
So that's a heaps interesting question, because I obviously have just made the switch to the A&D, the electric scale stuff, and then talking to Plushy last night was talking about getting a UPS, uninterrupted power system, because I was just running it, straight out the wall and that thing like that. So I knew that when going electric, you had to make some, you had to be careful of the room and temperature and all that stuff. But I thought with a beam scale, in my head, I was just like, she's a beam scale, it'll run, it doesn't matter what the weather's doing. But you're saying otherwise.
It's not the influence of what it does to the scale, which is kind of sort of where the question was coming from. You'll be able to throw consistent loads, which will probably be very good, but you read what the manufacturer says about the powder. Read what the manufacturer says about the primer, and it says, don't let it get wet. Well, if the humidity is 95%, you might not see it, but it's getting wet.
Yeah. I think I've got some stuff to add for you for that. So, for example, I converted. We've got a separate lounge. It's now known as the fun room. It used to be open fronted. Now it's got solid doors that close. All that sort of stuff. If you can, it's completely draft free. I don't reload on hot days because I need the air conditioner on. So we've got ducted reverse cycles that's blowing down. So having that sort of stuff, you want still air, no fans because it's hot. That sort of stuff. You need to have. If I'm throwing powder, that's all I do. I don't throw powder in seat. Because the bouncing of the press can upset the scales, things like that. If you're going to do that, have it on a bench over here. Keep them separate. Fluoros with ballasts are particularly bad for power supply. So that's what we're talking to Taylor. Any electronic scales, whether they're force or magnetic, or strain gauge, or magnetic, suffer from a dirty power supply. That could be anything from, I'm not a Sparky, but fridges, on TVs, anything on the same circuit, which you're going to have you probably only got two GPO circuits in your house. So
Or if you live like as far out as where I live, and power supply is some dudes in a room shoveling coal onto a fire just to get the power out to me. So.
you mentioned something about
I live in a rural area, and where our power supply is also less than perfectly reliable. The only thing electrical that I run when I'm running my scales is the light, and that's on a different circuit, and that's because I can't do very much in the dark.
routers are a good one as well to keep away. Yeah.
You do not want to see my reloading room.
Yeah.
What? I missed that. What'd you say?
Routers, like Wi-Fi routers and things like that.
Yep.
You want to be careful with that sort of stuff. No, not like a router, like routing the. No.
I won't even. I won't even allow anyone to bring their phone into my room.
So the purpose behind the UPS talking to Taylor is you said something about a 30-meter extension cord, and I got all scared.
Yeah.
I was like, don't.
It wasn't 30, but
Don't do it.
decent extension cord.
But
Yeah.
This acts as a what do you want to call it? Like a filter, a stabilizer to the power source. So it takes the power in, it's running through the battery, takes the power out, and out the other end you get a very stable power output. On a lot of most electronic scales, particularly the cheaper ones, your voltage will affect the calibration.
Yep.
So you turn them on an hour or two before you want to use them. You don't just turn them on, calibrate them, go, because you'll be you'll be chasing a little bit. But these are a really good idea, not because you want to be able to run when there's a power outage, just to filter your power. I put those on a set of Charge Master scales, results improved. And now that I've got a really good set of scales, I can tell you how to run your Charge Master or your Hornady Auto Tricker a lot more accurately, but you needed something very accurate to figure it out. There's ways of doing that as well. So keep the interference minimum, even like a speaker here playing some music or something like that. You don't really want that boom, 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 boom as you're doing it. Like
Yep.
you get a good set of scales, like one kernel is frustrating because you can't cut them in half.
Yeah. Look,
And the slightest breath of air is enough to upset them.
A&D is about as good as it gets, and even they will drift if you don't leave it turned on for an hour before you start. Right? And they'll still drift then. It's just that you'll go from a drift that's already pretty tight to even tighter, but you still have to check it from time to time.
I got that today from Officeworks for like $130 on these guys' recommendation. So.
Just quickly, what sort of variances are you seeing if you aren't running these UPSs and that sort of stuff? Like I'm working in a facility where we're weighing a product that's $10,000 a gram and we're not using any of this.
Cool.
Yeah.
So
I don't want to know what business you're in.
Yeah, it sounds interesting.
I'll repeat that for anyone online. Maxwell's question was the variance difference not running something like a UPS when his business that he works for you use lab scales, right? A&D scales and really expensive scales, and they're not running any sort of setup like this.
Yeah, I would spend some money. And I'd be sending him to a NADA certified lab to get them calibrated often. At
There you go.
Absolutely. It's hard to quantify what you're going to see, but you're going to see drift, definitely.
And Andy reloads with a RCBS Charge Master Lite without a UPS system, and he's a Sparky. So
Without a UPS, I got Wi-Fi in the same room. I have my computer sitting next to me playing a movie while I'm using it. Like everything I'm doing is apparently wrong. But
Look,
it
but
still works.
if you place it in context, it may or may not be, because if you're shooting out to 400 metres, 0.1 of a grain doesn't matter a rat's
No,
that's
patoot.
it.
I was actually about to
in your
add
hunting
to that.
scenario,
See,
you're not gonna.
the Charge Master and the balance beam scales, if you're a hunter or if you're shooting in competitions that don't extend more than 400 metres, you're getting really anally retentive over something that's not very important. Now, we went down that path because the A&D does two things for us. One, it allows us to work in a specialist area that most people don't work in, and there's no point boring you with those details because they're not relevant to you. But the other one too is that it's really quick. And if I'm going to load up 1, 2, 5 or 1,000, I don't want to be going
waiting for it to
Yeah.
level out.
I want to be able to go and wait for the auto throw, and look, every now and then it'll give you a slight overcharge and you go back and do it again.
And it's peace of mind too. Plushy and I have spoken about that. About Plushy's at a point with his shooting where he needs to know that if he misses a shot, it's something that he did. It's something that he did wrong rather than the ammo or the gun. So he's investing that money to save time and to have rounds that he knows are on point. So he's not sitting there going, why did that round just shoot high? Well, Plushy shot high. He did something that the butt of the rifle dropped and he shot over the top of the target, or he didn't have the right range, the right dope or something. So,
and I can tell you that out to 400 metres, 0.1 of a grain ain't going to matter.
There's another interesting point to add, and take one from what you will. But a lot of us are using optimal barrel time, and we're shooting in nodes that are 0.3, 0.4, 0.5 grains wide, and we're going down to the 0.02 of a grain. Like, are we investing our time, or are you investing your time in the right area? When you've developed a load that shoots accurately, 500 metres and in, like, don't worry about it. Spend the time that you're wasting. Go shoot. Like, get better at shooting. Sometimes you sit there and you reflect and you're like, am I actually wasting my time?
Being in that node, you talk about being in the node, whether you can talk about that, whether it's a velocity node for your powder charge or whether it's a seating depth node for your seating depth. Is there anyone here who wants clarification on that, or are people pretty across what they're meaning when they talk about that?
I was going to ask what you would do when you want to make a new load. Would you do like a ladder test to sort of work out where the nodes are, and then sort of go from there and change the seating depth to sort of try to...
That's a great question, and these guys might all have a bit of a different process.
Yeah.
Do you have a chronograph, or are you just shooting for groups? And all right. So
can I throw to? There's a guy at the back that's got a brilliant. He knows who I'm talking about. He's got a really good developed load that works really well every time. Do you want to share it, Tim?
cool. All right, grab the microphone. If Tim's sharing his load development, put him on the mic.
It's a little bit different to your way, Steve, but it's achievable to a lot of people that don't have access to quick load and stuff like that.
It's almost entirely upon data.
Well, actually,
so I use
we
a guy
can
called Scott
dispense
Sadley.
with the quick load altogether and still take a shortcut, but we'll come to that.
It's like precision rifle blog. At a location. So he
stand up and talk louder.
So he uses like a 10-shot load development method, which starts off by trying to find a velocity node in the smallest amount of ammunition possible. So what he would do, will I'll start from scratch. What I do, so if I've got a brand new gun, brand new load, new brass, have never shot it before, firstly I'll sweep to try and find pressure. So I want to know sort of how hard I can run it. I'll find pressure in normally half grain increments, or maybe 0.4s with a smaller case, a big Magnum like a 300 Norma in a half grain. So just say I think I might get away with going up to about 86 grains of powder. So I'll go 86, 85.5, 85, 84.5, and I'll shoot one shot at each of those loads, give the barrel a couple of minutes to cool down between them, and you'll start seeing that pressure. And when you start seeing pressure, you normally have a bit of headway there. So I go, okay, I've done my sweep. I know how hard I can run it, and then I'll start at a point where I'm comfortable. So normally that's sort of, if I've run into pressure at say 86.5 grains, I'll go down to 86 grains and go, that's as hard as I want to run it. And I'll step back from 86 grains in 0.2 grain increments. And then I'm looking for my velocity node, and I'll fire one shot at each of those increments. So it's a Scott Sadley style pressure node method. So second sweep. So at this point, I'm normally about 10 rounds in, and I use I've got a bunch of spreadsheets that I've created for mapping that data. I'll chart the data. You can normally see it. So you can normally see a fairly clear velocity node. So I go, okay, my velocity node might be 0.4, 0.6 grains wide. And then I will load up at that, and I'll do a seating depth test, or even before I do a seating depth test, if I'm starting sort of 40 thou off the lands, just to do all of my testing with, I might go and load up 10 rounds at that one charge to try and validate that, okay, in 2 5-shots, I've done it in a 1-shot string, and now I validate that in 2 5-shot strings, I'm getting the extreme spreads and the standard deviations that I want, and I'll shoot that over a chronograph, obviously. If that's good, and then I'm happy with my velocity and the standard deviations that I'm getting out of it and the extreme spreads, probably more particularly extreme spread, then I'll check for setting depth nodes. There's some, there's some research and reading that I've sort of come across recently that I've tested out 2 or 3 times now, and I've come to believe there's merit to it. So a lot of people will either jump or jam their bullets. So a lot of F-class shooters, guys that don't ever have to pull around out of the chamber when it's hot, will try and jump. Particularly will try and jam rather. Particularly VLDs, or you'll start your sort of 15 or 20 thou off. I've starting my load development about 40 thou off, and I'll go 40, 60, 80, 100, 120. And the research that I've read that I've in my personal testing that I think has merit, seems to find that the setting depth nodes that you find tend to be a lot wider than people expect. So the traditional thinking is that you tune setting depth in sort of a 5 thou increment. What I've found is that you start about 40 thou out, and your setting depth node will normally be sort of 20 or 40 thou wide. There's a lot more variance, and the nodes that you find further out from the lands tend to be more durable. And as your barrel wears and as you throw to roads, you have to tune them less than those that may be 10 or 15 thou out from the land. So at that point, you've done your pressure test, 8 or 10 rounds. You've done a Satterley style velocity sweep. Maybe 8 or 10 rounds. You've done 10 rounds in ES and SD validation. You're 30 rounds in at this point, and then you do your setting depth test. So at that point, you might run a string of sort of 5-shots groups. So within normally about 50 rounds, I've got a load that's shooting and is pretty durable.
You said you don't have a chronograph, so when he's velocity testing for that node, he's just shooting groups, right, and seeing where things start to flatten out groups-wise, like for elevation?
Yeah, generally when you see a velocity node, you'll also see, if you're shooting at distance, say 500 metres, you'll start to see, as you start with your lower charges, point of impact will generally start to creep up. And then you'll see, when you start to get a velocity node, you'll start to see a point of impact flat spot as well. And that's your barrel is harmonically in balance.
Yep.
At that point, and so you can do it. Ideally, you would do it with a chronograph and on paper, but you can do it before chronographs were readily available. They did it on paper and it worked pretty well. I've also done the same method by putting a chronograph on and shooting 20 rounds into the dirt, and then pick my velocity flat spot, got my seating depths, almost one hole groups. You can do it either or, both. Both is preferred. Depends what you've got access to.
And look, I'd have to agree with all of that. I'd do it a little bit differently, but I think it's more a nuance than a catastrophic change. If rule 1 is to match your bullet to your barrel, rule 2 is to set your seating depth before you go any further. Right now, starting at 40 thou, we did a whole series of tests that for our particular product, we come up with exactly what you said, 40 to 60 thou off the land seems to give you the most tolerant, accurate loads, and that's true. Only to have Precision Rifle Blog say that they did exactly the same test using different type of product. They were using jacketed leads and we were using copper, and you would have thought completely different product, completely different style, you'd get different results, and their results and our results turned out to be so dang close as to be pretty much the same. And I've gone, I wasn't expecting that, because we did all our investment in our own product, and so that we could give a recommended guideline, only to find that it appears to be damn close to a universal principle. So you start at 40, I start at 50, and I find that a significant number of loads seem to work closer between 50 and 60, but there's always the exception, and I found quite a few that work at 40 as well. Yeah. But with our product, particularly with a monolith or a copper, you do not want to go closer than 40. Sometimes with a jacketed lead product, you will get better results going closer, but it's the exception, not the rule, and they're less tolerant. So rule 1 is match your bullet. Rule 2 is set your seating depth. Then start playing with your charge is the way I go about it. You talk about making adjustments afterwards. Well, I find that generally at somewhere between 50 and 60, you're so dang close that once you've got your load right, a minor variation in your seating depths doesn't seem to make much difference.
Travi, you had your hand up. What do you? Oh, you're just yeah.
You just want to make sure that you've got a good amount of distance on there, something like the 300 metre mark, where you're actually going to see a deviation.
where you're
in
going to see it.
velocity.
Yeah.
Obviously, yeah, that's a given. But yeah, the further you can stretch out, even if you get out to 500 or something like that, you're going to see better results. And if you don't have a chronograph, that's going to give you more of a visual. Yeah.
And what Emma set up the back is absolutely spot on. You don't need quick load to do it. You don't need a chronograph to do it. All you need is the ultimate lie detector, which is
the bullet doesn't lie. Jacob Bynum said
that lie detector we call the target.
And what sort of environmentals would you have to take in consideration if you were doing that at 300 or 500?
Well, firstly, I wouldn't be doing it on a windy day.
No, that's it.
Because it's just going to be deceiving. But
one like a day that if you got out super early, say 7 a.m., and you were doing that test through to 10 a.m., you might see a significant temperature difference and boils in.
I actually do all my testing between 15 and 20 degrees C.
Yep.
All right. So that's mostly because in the zone in which we work, you're getting no more than about 10 to 15 degree variation. Yep. I don't know how you would go about it if you were living in the Antarctic or living in Darwin, because you would only be able to test it under one set of environmental conditions, which is not very flexible. So we do all our testing between 15 and 20, and obviously we prefer to do it on a still day.
Well, Butters just came down here from Darwin and just won the Monado Meltdown, the first PRS match of the year, and his gun was obviously hammering, so... It's obviously possible. It's just less than ideal.
I think
there's always the exception to prove the rule.
Yeah. If you're not sure, get your ballistics calculator out and plug in the temperature at 7 o'clock in the morning that's 10 degrees, and see what your hold's going to be at 500 meters, and then if it's going to be 20 degrees at 10 a.m., see what your hold at 500 meters is going to be, and you're going to find it's going to be about that much. And I personally wouldn't be too concerned if I could get at 500 meters 4 or 5 bullets, charge weights in a row that are within that much. I'm satisfied, and that's my starting point.
Well, because we are recommending guidelines for people in all locations, some of them are in Tasmania and some of them in Darwin. We have to. What we do is we'll get a load, and I'll set 5 rounds in an ice box, and I'll use an electronic thermometer. And when that ammunition reads 0. I don't give a stuff about where it's going. I'll just use the chronograph and measure its velocity. And then I'll put it in the same box under the car heater and get it to about 38, 40 degrees and just do exactly the same thing and measure its velocity. And what I'm doing when I do that is I'm measuring both the variation in the pressure and the variation in feet per second. All right? That's at another level, but there's nothing actually stopping you from doing it. All you need is a good thermometer, and you'll find out very, very quickly how sensitive your powder is. Some powders are very sensitive to that, and you look, it worked really great at 15 degrees, but at 0 or at 38 degrees, it was a nightmare. And others, you'll go, shit, this doesn't matter.
Yeah. I got a pro tip for you here.
One thing.
Yeah, go for it.
You can do that test.
I was joking. I don't really have it.
Oh, well, you can do that, and you can put that information into your Kestrel.
Yeah.
And then your Kestrel knows. And then your Kestrel will make the adjustment for you.
Yeah.
My pro tip was if you go to a reloading night, don't let your missus know that it's live streamed, because she's just asked Rusty, hey, Rusty, question for Taylor. So how much does all this reloading biz actually cost?
I got into reloading to save money.
Yeah. It saves money, right? Taylor is so good looking, he gets it all for free, Jess. My man. My man.
Last question from online that we'll be able to get to.
Yep. Last question.
One more in the room. This one thought was good. It was from Wade. It's about sizing. You hear a lot of reloaders, specifically long-range PRS guys, talking about full-length sizing cases to achieve a 1 to 3 thou shoulder bump. Would undersized cases cause large SDs or have any effect on SDs?
So by undersized, are we meaning virgin brass that has a huge shoulder bump, or undersized as in a 0 headspace load?
Do you mean a huge bump, like a factory die is bumping like 20 thou or something like that?
I'm assuming that's what he means, because...
Okay, there was a series of tests done and I'll give credit where it's due to Brian Litz on this one. They did a series of tests on new brass, and they've done the sizing and all the rest of it, and found that the most accurate load without annealing was usually the third load, and then it started to degrade again. So the first one, the first virgin shot, the brass was good. It got a little better on the second. It was best at third and then started to degrade again. And that's basically how we've done it. We get it to number 3 and then we start thinking about annealing because it's basically formed to your chamber. Everything's spot on. But if you expect, look, sometimes it happens that you get absolute screaming hammers out of your first load, and it's happy days when it happens. But it doesn't happen often. And once you get to the third reload, you've got it, and then from there on in, you've got to do what Simon does, and that's
anneal.
Clean and anneal.
So yeah, he were closer to, like he was saying about, if you've got a big shoulder bump and there's a lot of room for that shoulder to move before it seals the chamber versus one that's like a 0 headspace load, but we can't get it in the chamber. I guess his question was, are you seeing huge SDs with too much shoulder bump, an undersized case?
It's hard to answer that question.
Yeah.
But if it was consistent and the same every time, there's a possibility that it would work perfectly fine. But what you are doing is working your brass very, very hard.
Because you're moving
Because you're moving the shoulder down and it grows, and you're moving the shoulder down and it grows. And you're probably going to find that brass isn't going to last that long with that process. But yeah, I couldn't give you, in my experience, a straight answer on that.
If something's consistent, it can still work even when it's consistently not correct. Consistency is the issue. And if you can keep it consistent, and as long as it's within sensible tolerances, you're probably going to get a very consistent result.
Yeah, that's good. We might have time for one more question from the room, and then we'll probably just hang out and all chat and whatever. So is there anyone that's got a final question?
Better be a good one.
Okay, yeah, Ben.
Yeah, I do. Just on Steve's point before around temperature testing of your ammunition. So you talked about cooling and heating your ammunition. What do you do around the rifle to try and get it to temperature, or do you find that doesn't actually have an effect on the result?
Well, basically, that's a really good question. There's very little you can. There really is very little you can do. The best you can do is have it in the box, whether it's at the ice end or the heated end. Right, keep it in one of those insulated boxes, and this is why I'm not worried about accuracy at this point. What I'm doing here is I'm measuring velocity and pressure. That means you're pulling one out, putting it in, firing it, and out it comes, and the next one goes in real quick. The gap between the box and the rifle and the cartridge being fired has to be as short as possible, which means that accuracy shooting is it's not on the agenda, right? You're measuring other than accuracy. You're measuring pressure. You're measuring velocity, because that's data that's going to be used in the Kestrel or whatever else it is that you're using, whichever program. The gap from coming from out of the box and in the air has to be as short as possible. And trying to manage the temperature of the rifle is all but impossible.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
And at what point do you believe the crossover is for actually needing to do that type of testing for a particular situation?
Are you saying distance or?
Distance, yeah. Or
Application.
Application. Yeah.
Okay, it really comes down to application. The military do it routinely. If you're a hunter, you might want to do it. If you're an international hunter that's chasing something in somewhere in Tasmania and you're off to Africa a day after, you might want to do it then. But generally speaking, if you're living in this part of the world and you're not travelling more than a couple of 100K, develop a load that works for you and stop mucking around. What Plush is doing is working for him fine. What does he really care if what it's going to do in the Antarctic if he's not going to go there? You don't do that. You worry about the things. The important thing in this game is to worry about the things that are important and don't worry about the things that aren't. So don't go creating problems if they're not there.
I think to go back to your original question, what about your equipment in the heat or the cold? I think regardless of whether it's cold or hot outside, when you start shooting it, it's going to be hot inside. So I wouldn't worry about if your bullet's minus 10 and your rifle's plus 20, because after the first shot it's going to be hot. So I wouldn't put too much weight on what the rifle is about the ammunition, or the temperature of the powder when it ignites.
This influence that we're talking about regarding testing at low temperature and high temperature has the biggest influence on the first shot, right? That's really important on the two-way rifle range. It's much less important at 200 metres on the at the club match. And if you're hunting fallow deer and your accuracy is plus or minus this on a target that's this, so what?
Yeah, I was going to say the only thing I've been aware of is for my spotlighting. When I reload for my spotlighting, if I know that my reloads are up at the top end before I see pressure, and let's say I'm out the back and my ammo's cold, that's fine. But if I've got ammo that's up on the dash and nice and warm, and I know I'm already at that top end of pressure, that's where you might just want to keep that in mind. That is
absolutely spot on, because I've seen Southerners go up to the territory, put their box of ammo on the dash, and then wonder why they can't lift the bolt. Or I've actually seen worse, but that's enough.
It's one other little tip back on scales that I encountered. If you have scales that run off of a battery, make sure you either take that battery out or replace it regularly. I often early on I would just throw my powder with a powder thrower and then check it on a battery set of scales. And it wasn't until a few months in I noticed that my powder charges were changing quite a lot, and of course my battery was going flat. Didn't even know it. So
I would add to that: use lithium batteries wherever you can, because your standard lead acid batteries, they start at whatever voltage and they drop off to a point where the electronics don't work. Lithium has a very flat power output, and when it's flat, it just falls off a cliff. So you get a very stable power output. With anything like your kestrels or your scales, anything like that that's sensitive electronics, use lithium.
That's a good point.
And when they don't leak like lead acid and ruin things as well. Might catch fire, but
awesome. Well, that might wrap up the formal side of things. So massive thanks. Let's give a round of applause to these dudes for coming along and making it happen. If you guys want to stick around and pick their brains, I'm sure they'll be happy to talk for a little bit longer yet. And so, yeah, make yourselves known and let's have some fun. Oi! Maxwell, you shoot better with a Nerf gun than you do at a PRS range.
Yeah, better not be Joe. Better not.